analysis, aspirations on one theme, no, that is debts or loans from the IMF and the World Bank, and the roles of that in steering, shaping, and caging actually countries, economies, and policies for the benefit of a few. So we want to answer, how do people's organizations see this reality, and what are their aspirations for change? No? So we are holding this session today in a time when the IMF and the World Bank are doing at least three things in our view. Number one, they are attempting to reconsolidate and retool their power amid the growing discontent against the dominant economic model and the long-running policies of privatization, deregulation, and liberalization. So since late last year, through the spring meetings in April in Washington, D.C., we have observed that the World Bank has been doing an initiative to supposedly reform itself, no, in response to the ongoing multiple crises, no, while at the same time hiding away their own responsibility in supporting corporations and finance capital that are generating and creating these crises and inequalities, no. Secondly, they are continuing to sink the global south in loans, no, in this chronic indebtedness and crises. And thirdly, they are still passing the burdens of these crises on the people, with super profits originating from the drains, no, the extraction from our budget cuts, no, from interest payments on loans, and from locking in our countries to be export-oriented and import-dependent for corporate interest. No? So our session today on debt, dictates, and economic sovereignty is the kick-off activity to reclaim our future, a series of discussions, workshops, and fora that hopes to develop a common understanding and agenda towards October during the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank in Marrakesh, Morocco rather. So if you want to be involved, feel free to contact any of our partner organizations that I mentioned in the beginning, or directly reach out to IFIs out of recovery at gmail.com. IFIs out of recovery at gmail.com. So part of our objective this afternoon, this morning, is to link up better with social movements and to support ongoing national and international campaigns, especially here from our friends in Manila, and also to hear from the Arab people's perspective, no? As the IFIs, the IMF and the World Bank, operates in their region and their countries, so that we can develop a more united understanding about how to look at these institutions. At the end, we will synthesize the discussion, and that synthesis will feed into succeeding work towards our collective response in the annual meetings in October. So with that said, we have three panelists for today. We have Noel Colina from the Secretariat of the People Over Profit Network, a workers-led global campaign network that unites working peoples, social movements, and NGOs to fight corporate plunder. We have Cham Perez from the Center for Women's Resources, an organization which aims to empower grassroots women through awareness raising and supporting their efforts in improving their situation through structural change. And last but not the least, we have with us online Mr. Hani Ibrahim, representing the Nawat Institute, a network of independent Arab organizations engaged in policy research towards participatory development based on the priorities of Arab societies. No? Mr. Ibrahim is also involved in various capacities at the Egypt's National Council for Human Rights, the Al-Marusa for Development and Participation, among others. No? So without further ado, let us begin. No? First, we hope to hear from you, Noel. I know that People Over Profit has been working against neoliberal globalization for some years now and has been advocating for systemic change. So we want to hear from you, how do you see the IMF and the World Bank's use of loans, no, in relation to sovereignty, our supposed sovereignty, right, over our economies, especially in the global south. So Noel, you have the floor, and I believe you have slides that will be shared from here on.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the invite, and good day, good evening, good afternoon to everyone who's online joining this event. So I belong to the Secretariat of the People Over Profit. We're a platform against foreign trade free trade agreements. And I'll be sharing some thoughts on debt and how debt now is being used by IFIs to control, as mentioned already, cage and bring the low-income countries, the poor countries, the countries from the global south in control, in to whip them in line. So yeah, if you can see here, my first slide would be about the LICs, the low and income countries. No, most of them would be belonging from Africa. Those in red are countries in debt distress. But most of the low-income countries would be either high or moderate in debt. No? So it's really a big problem with debt for many of the countries from the global south. But it's not only about the low income countries. If you also check, let's see, from the low to middle income countries like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Tunisia, for example, this is the debt to GDP ratio. This is the central government debt. As you can see, Sri Lanka is more than 100% debt to GDP ratio. You have Tunisia was almost more than 80%, and Pakistan close to 80%. So it's really a big concern for this middle income countries. But it's not only these countries. We can also see, next slide, countries like Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, who are also in danger of being really in debt. Philippines close to 60% in debt. You have Indonesia who's around more than 40% debt to GDP ratio. So it means that the amount of their debt is almost half of their GDP. So it's very difficult for these countries to be able to pay such debt. And we're only talking about public debt. This is just government debt. We're not talking about international sovereign debt, like debt from these governments releasing bonds. This is another matter. So it's a layer upon layer of debt that many of these countries are facing. Next slide, please. So usually the process would be if a country is in dire straits, no? in economic ruin, they look to the IMF or they look to the World Bank or ADB for that matter, or other lending agencies. That could be AAIB, or now even private, because IMF World Bank has this private window, no, where private companies can provide loans. So they would take a loan, and then IMF would give them loan, but there's always this but, no? There are conditionalities to this loan. So before a country is given the go signal for that loan, they have to follow these conditionalities provided by the IMF. And that's the way it goes. And then these conditionalities, as we can see later on, brings the economy of these countries into more ruin. They're not being taken out of the current problem, but it brings them deeper into poverty and economic ruin. And this has been going on for many decades, since the 80s, where layers upon layers of neoliberal reforms have been imposed on many countries, especially countries from the global south, and they have followed this, and then it has brought them to more deeper economic ruin. Also, let's say, for example, let's look at Pakistan. No? Next slide. So here, Pakistan is now in danger of having, they're really in debt. And there is a big need for them to, big source of funds. So for Pakistan, what the IMF is this is just the IMF. No, I'm not talking about the other lenders. But before Pakistan requested loans from the IMF, the IMF had this paper. It was released in September 2022. It's a country report on Pakistan, and they said that the subsidies provided by the government of Pakistan, this relief package that was implemented in February 2022, which includes subsidies for fuel and electricity, the IMF called this as fiscal slippage, because it meant more expenses, more spending from the government. And that is not something that the IMF doesn't want. They don't want the government to spend, to support the people in dire need. No? So what they did, this is the conditionalities for Pakistan, is if you want to take loans from IMF, you have to raise fuel taxation. You have to phase out fuel subsidies. And there should be an automatic pricing mechanism for fuel. And aside from that, they wanted to impose additional custom duties on fuel coming to Pakistan. Not only that, they wanted to impose more austerity measures for the Pakistani government. They wanted to limit spending from the government to only 16.9% of GDP. There was a minimum wage increase before February 2022 for the workers and also for the government employees. The IMF said, no, don't do this. Don't increase wages. Don't increase the pay of the government employees. That's bad. That's spending too much. You should limit it to only 16.9%. So no pension increases as well, no? And then they wanted to end the food subsidies that the government was giving to many of the poor Pakistanis. They also wanted to limit power subsidies, increase excise tax on cigarettes. This is a regressive taxation. So it's consumption taxes that they wanted. So that's Pakistan. Let's look at Sri Lanka, for example. Next slide. For Sri Lanka, they also wanted to raise taxation. They said, oh, Sri Lanka, as we all know, is already in default. No? So they wanted to raise taxation. So income tax has been raised. And they wanted to impose a market-driven currency exchange rate for Sri Lanka. They wanted to end, IMF wanted to end fuel subsidies as well as electricity subsidies. And another one is they wanted Sri Lanka to sell state-owned enterprises that are not profitable. So these are the conditionalities that the IMF is imposing upon Sri Lanka. Next slide. Let's look at Tunisia, for example. Next would be Tunisia. No? Tunisia has been providing some subsidies for fuel as well as electricity, and they wanted to erase that. IMF said, no subsidies. And they wanted to raise fuel prices. So this will be a source of revenue for the government, which will be used to pay IMF. They wanted to freeze. So again, just like what they did with Sri Lanka and Pakistan, more austerity measures, freeze public sector wages, as well as freeze hiring of additional government employees. And just like Sri Lanka, they wanted to restructure the state-owned enterprises. So this, again, the state-owned becomes private. No? So in this environment, the gainers and losers would always be, the gainers, of course, will be the IFIs, the TNCs, who will be taking over those private enterprise, the public enterprises. And of course, the losers would always be the working people, the farmers, the workers, the youth, even the middle class. As you can see, there was an increase in income taxes in Tunisia. And again, looking back to Tunisia, recently, last day is June, no? So in April, the Tunisian president said, no, we don't want to follow the foreign diktats of the IMF. So they said, okay, there was news about that. And then immediately after that, next slide, these are the news reports. So, oh, Tunisia will collapse. Tunisia, the bonds are down. It's an economic ruin if they don't follow IMF dictates. So this is how these IFIs try to pressure the small countries, the poor countries, into following what they want. And for us, for the people over profit, this is our demands mainly. We want to cancel all erroneous debts coming from especially debt coming from debt of the countries from the global south. We want an end to austerity measures. Government need to spend for healthcare, for supporting for funding social protection. And we want these funds not coming from debt. It has to come from progressive taxation, tax the rich. Get the money from the rich, not from debt. Use that to use that funds to spend on social protection, on healthcare for all, education. And then we are calling for an end to all neoliberal policies. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Noel, for providing that overview and baseline analysis of how the People Over Profit Network as a campaign network now fighting corporate plunder, how they look at these institutions and their impacts and their aspirations, vis-a-vis these institutions. So we hope to even concretize this analysis from further concrete experiences, and other demands through our last two panelists, Cham Perez and Hani Ibrahim. So Cham, Hani, I mean, in that order, could you share with us some of your reflections on, in Cham's case, the experience of women in the Philippines, and followed by experiences in the Arab countries, for Hani. So Cham, you have the floor, and then Hani, you can directly proceed after Cham's sharing. So you have the floor, Cham.
Thank you, Jay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. My task here today is to give a glimpse of the experiences of Filipino women and the people in relation to the dictates of the IMF and the World Bank Group. Thank you to Noel for laying down the basics of the IMF and the World Bank and its conditionalities. So the Philippines has been in a relationship with the IMF and the World Bank Group for several decades now, and it has played a significant role in shaping Philippine economic policies stemming from loan conditionalities that have had an adverse impact on women and people's human rights. It was already mentioned, some of these conditionalities would mean adoption of neoliberal economic policies emphasizing market-led growth, liberalization, privatization, austerity measure, deregulation. And these have resulted in the case of the Philippines, in the persisting economic backwardness and state abandonment of public services. Now, the intricacies of the IMF and the World Bank loans and policy conditionalities is not, commonly understood. If you go to the communities, they'll just look at you puzzled, thinking, what is the IMF World Bank? What does it have to do with me? And yet, the consequences of its policies and its dictates is felt by everyone, especially of poor women. The crisis brought by the IMF and the World Bank Group permeates all facets of a woman's life, whether she is at work, in factories, or in the field, or while she is at home or in the community. So because of the multiplicity of the role of women, so we bear the heaviest burden of economic and debt crises because of these debt-driven dictates and policies. Because while women are impacted by liberalization and deregulation policies, as we contribute in economic production, as workers, as farmers, we are also disproportionately affected by austerity measures, as women would spend twice as much more time in performing care and domestic duties more than men. So let's go over, no, when women are at work in factories and in the field. Pushed by the IMF and the World Bank, the thrust of the government has been to liberalize the economy. So focus on exports, encourage foreign investments, purportedly to spur growth and generate jobs. No? Next slide. But all these have little to do with improving women's lives and livelihood. Decades on, we've seen millions of women are still economically insecure. That is 15.7 million in 2017. That would account for 42.4 percent of women's population, age 15 years old and above. This is actually even higher than the 39.3% or 8.9 million in 1998. Now, to encourage foreign investments, the regulation in labor policies have been adopted. This led to various forms of labor flexibilization, raise to bottom wages, and the tax against workers' right to unionize. Next slide. And as the economy cannot generate enough jobs, many are forced into informal sector where there is little income and no social protection. Now we go to the countryside. Women are impacted by the reduction of subsidies for agriculture because the IMF doesn't want that. No? In recent years, the IMF and the World Bank have urged the Philippine government to enact the rice liberalization law. So that was in 2019 as a condition for the approval of a $297 million loan. Next slide. This resulted in a decrease in the livelihood of small farmers. So according to one study, Filipino farmers incurred an estimated 66 billion peso loss because of rice liberalization, while the gross value of palay production decreased by 92 billion. In the countryside, as well, we also see the impacts of microfinance schemes, many of which are supported and actually funded by the World Bank. So supposedly as a means to improve the lives of women. But for women, we have seen microfinance becomes a debt trap. High interest rates and inflexible repayment terms make it difficult for women to repay the debts, especially that the loans that are supposed to be used to set up a small business or as capital for their agricultural production will be used, no, to support the basic needs of the family. And I saw the slide earlier, no? The situation is so worst in the Philippines that thousands of women are forced to leave the country every day to find work, no? Out of the 1.8 million overseas Filipino workers, 1.1 million or 60% are women. Now, that is while women is at work in factories or in farms, no? When she comes home, no, from the factory or from the fields, the dictates of IMF and the World Bank will still haunt her. This is because as the government prioritizes debt repayment over social spending, this would mean reduction in public investments in health, education, and other basic services. So the Marcos legacy, Marcos Senior legacy, the automatic appropriations law mandated automatic appropriations for debt servicing. That is even before allocating for social spending. So in the Philippines, annually, almost 1/3 of the national budget would go to debt servicing, resulting to lesser budget allocated for public services. Now, what are the concrete impacts? Can we go to the next slide? So on health, uh, the health sector was for 2023 allocated only 5.62% of the total national budget, no? Um, and low health budget would mean danger for women's health. In 2021, 2,478 women died of maternal causes, so maternal mortality. Deaths which studies show could have been prevented if only they have been given immediate medical attention. Next slide on housing. For decades, the Philippine government refuses to spend for affordable housing, no? Giving only 10.4 billion for housing and community development. That is not even 1% of the total national budget. This is while millions of Filipinos are homeless, uh, and the country is still short of 6.7 million housing units to shelter Filipinos for a dignified life. Next slide. In 1997, in 1997, the World Bank Group pushed for water privatization in the Philippines. So Filipinos were promised of cheap, safe and secure water services, and yet after um, more than 25 years, no, 11 million Filipinos still do not have access to safe water supply. Water rates shoot up, and of course it has impacts to women and girls who are burdened by the task of fetching water to their homes. Another key plank of the Philippine structural reform agenda dictated by the IMF, we all know this, is the deregulation of the oil sector. But instead of competitive prices, decades of implementation of the oil deregulation law saw very high um, and unabated and questionable increases in petroleum prices since 1998. No? And in the recent years, no, as if the oil deregulation law is not enough. No? In 2018, the Philippine government implemented the train law that imposed excise taxes on fuel, no, alongside expanding value added taxes. So this was mentioned earlier. These forms of regressive taxation leads to increase in prices for basic products and services, and would definitely burden women in low income households who would bear the cost of increased living expenses. So, be it at work or be it at home, the dictates of the IMF and the World Bank definitely did not benefit women and the people. Its debt-driven policies in the Philippines has had severe negative impacts, no, on the rights of women and marginalized communities, only perpetuating poverty, inequality, and injustice. So should I go to the demands, or I can? Okay. Now for the demands, I put here just 4 points. Can we go to the next slide? Okay. The first one is to cancel or repudiate debts, no, because doing this would enable um our governments to use the resources to provide for basic services for the people. No? and implement, of course, implement policies that would ensure women and people's human rights and ensure social protection for the people. The second one is to prioritize domestic mobilization of resources. To do this, it is a must that we tackle illicit financial flows that drain money from our domestic economy. Another important source of revenues, it was also mentioned earlier, would be higher taxes for the wealthier segments of the population, the rich, and of course, the corporations. This would also include reversing tax incentives because we've been losing a lot of money from tax incentives that the governments implement just to attract foreign direct investments. Next one would be for developed countries to fulfill financing and development cooperation commitments. So we know that donor countries need to fulfill the historical commitment of ODA equivalent to 0.7 of their GNI. And of course, aid should fulfill its mandate of reducing poverty, inequalities, and must adhere to development effectiveness principles. And lastly, there is a need to strengthen people's participation. This means that the people, the workers, the farmers, indigenous peoples, the urban poor, who are the real engines of growth, we must reclaim our capacity to influence and drive domestic policies, and of course not the IMF and the World Bank dictating domestic policies and only trampling on women and people's human rights. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Cham, for ending on the note of people sovereignty, to reclaim the power to have a say on what policies and what kinds of economies are appropriate for our countries. So without further ado, Mr. Ibrahim, please go ahead for your reflections on from the Arab region. Hope you can feel free to turn on your microphone and camera now. Please go ahead.
Okay. Do you hear me now?
Loud and clear.
Okay. First, I would like to thank you for inviting me to this very important workshop and the discussions, because the topic of or the relation between debt and the sovereignty is very important, especially right now in Arab countries. Thank you for the reflections and the presentations from the Women Resources Center, because it gave us some indication about the negative impact of the IMF debts especially on women and vulnerable groups. Let me reflect on this. We have to differentiate between what is the public perception on the IMF debts and the facts, because social media and media in general sometimes give exaggeration on topics, and the experts working with IMF always use the wrong media information to justify their recommendations, to justify their programs, and always accuse media of spreading wrong information about the work of the IMF. But on the other hand, we will not use what social media or what the media reports about the IMF. We will look to the facts and the findings of independent research. Independent researchers used quantitative and qualitative benchmarks indicators in order to assess the impact of IMF debt policies on the level of poverty and to assess the impact, the negative impact of the IMF debts on the decent life of the people. What independent and international organization found in 20 in the report published by UNDP, the United Nations Development Program in 2022, found that 46 countries couldn't pay their debts in 2020. According to current indicators, there are two other Arab countries are at risk not to pay back their sovereign debts to the IMF, and I'm speaking about Tunisia and Egypt. They are at risk not to be able to pay the debts. What independent researcher found? We found that IMF debts policies and the conditionalities led to three outcomes: increased unemployment, increased costs of basic services, the restructuring programs for tax collections, pensions, and social securities always affect poor people, not the wealthy people. It means that we are in a position to threat the stability and the life of poor people, and the terminology which is always published and circulated by UN agencies like decent work, decent life, sustainable development, actually are at risk because of the conditionality of IMF policies. So when we talk with the IMF experts and the IMF people, we have to push them to uncover realities about their policies and to be accountable in regard to the consequences of their conditionality on the poverty and on the deprivation that developing countries are facing because of their policies and imposing structural reform and pushing them to adopt policies that lead to increased poverty in their countries. In the objectives of the workshop, in this seminar, you highlighted that the IMF always hide their responsibility, and the IMF always not consider the consequences on the global south. By facts and by reports, this is true, and IMF must be accountable to their policies. And I would like to refer to two important documents on the relation between IMF loans and the human rights. They are the UN Human Rights Commission issued two important documents: the guiding principles for human rights impact assessment for economic reform policies, which was issued in 2018, and the guiding principles on foreign debt and human rights, which was issued in 2011. The two documents give qualitative and quantitative indicators and benchmarks to assess how the IMF loans could affect human rights, could affect negatively the sustainability of developing countries, and it is capacity to have a welfare system that can improve the social and economic life for the poor. One more reflection that there is a correlation between the interference of IMF in national policies and the increased corruption in developing countries. Always loans and provided by IMF increase the corruption. Why? First, because the structural reform programs lead to privatization policies, and governments and corrupt leaders always use structural reforms as a justification to sell or to privatize public companies with low prices in order to gain personal profits. Corruption increased while the structural reform programs by IMF always on the move, on the rise. So if we have a recommendation in this workshop, we have to recommend that IMF, in case countries borrow from the IMF, must monitor the restructuring programs and must always put conditions on the level of corruption. But unfortunately, what is the IMF programs right now always focus on two things: privatization and the increased costs of the basic services, and always look to the public services as an income for governments. So the IMF push governments to increase their revenues through basic services, not through increased economic reform, not through increased the production of industry, or not through innovative digitalization for the countries, but always the restructuring programs of the IMF focus on two things: the public services and the privatization of public companies to be owned by private sector. And this is my reflections on this issue. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Hani Ibrahim, for your reflections, and also both our panelists that told their concrete experiences and reflections were talking about some level of work that needs to be done in terms of highlighting the realities, no? Because as our friend Hani has mentioned, no, the IMF has been rather hiding or not acknowledging fully the impacts and the extents of the harms that are being created by their impositions on countries. And at the same time, when we go to the countries themselves, no, our friend Cham here was saying that there needs to be further conversations on really exposing how are the problems that we are facing right now connected concretely to distinct impositions of these IFIs. In Cham's words, I think the term haunting that she used was very appropriate in that these impositions seem like ghosts, right? We don't see them perhaps in our daily lives, but they are there. They are present. They are haunting us, and they are pushing certain things around the house that we may not be seeing daily. And in the end, no, it affects us all, and we need to make that connection. No? Especially, I know that certain social movements today are, for instance, in the Philippines, are highlighting the struggle against inflation. No? When they say in Tagalog, presyo ibaba. And I think what Cham has highlighted is how these prices that we are experiencing right now they are correlated with historical and still active IMF and World Bank dictates and has been active for a long time. So we need to make that connection in the course of our work. So thanks everyone again for those analyses, experiences, and aspirations. No? And we now open the floor for further discussion for those in Zoom. Just raise a hand, and also here in Manila, just do the same. No, we'll call your names as soon as we are alerted of who raises a hand. So anyone from Zoom who has been raising a hand? So while we're waiting, let me just acknowledge some of the remarks at the group chat at the Zoom chat by now. Julia Puno of APRN was saying that I think this is directed to Cham, that in the first recommendation, there might be room to discuss further enhanced public spending for social development to include standards of living and social protection alongside education and health. Given the current underspending on this front. And Ahmed Chebuni was also acknowledging his presence from Morocco and that Moroccan people suffered from IMF in the past. No? And I think Julia was also replying that the second recommendation on could be split to discuss national legal taxation to curb tax evasions and on the other flank, the illicit financial flows which you mentioned. So any feedback also from Zoom by now? So there's a hand raise, no? So just introduce yourself or your organization and feel free to have the floor. Ali Jilani, go ahead.
Hi, this is Ali Jilani from Pakistan. I'm sorry, I logged in through Julia's link, so the comments are also coming in that sense. So I just basically wanted to flag a couple of issues here. First is the idea of COVID-19 being a direct consequence of schematized interventions in terms of decreased public spending in countries like Pakistan, for instance. That's been a precedent for over like 30 odd years. And we saw that happening globally, which is what sort of like, enfeebled the healthcare infrastructure in particular around the world, which is why we saw that, it couldn't withstand something like COVID-19. Howsoever, at the multilateral level, when you look at the discussions and, all these consultations and everything, there was no sense of accountability, neither any kind of acknowledgement as to whether some of these IFIs have been responsible for the very crises that we experience today. So that's one thing. And what happened was during COVID-19 itself, then we were tracking at that time in 2020, 2020, and then 2021's first half, we saw that 76 out of 91 IMF negotiated loans pushed for further belt tightening measures. And even, that strange name, Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust, the new program that they initiated during COVID-19 was extremely invasive and, very difficult for developing countries, putting them literally in an uphill battle against sovereign debt crises. So I think, those kind of patterns also need to be exposed. The other thing was a very interesting perspective that we saw during the APFST. We had this person who heads the macroeconomic division of UNESCAP, happens to be a Pakistani, so we all suffer the debt crises together. But he came with a very interesting perspective when we argued that all of these conditionalities are affecting our countries in a very bad situation. He said that, oh, no, actually, it's not the countries, it's not the IMF who pushes for those conditionalities. Your countries are given a priority, and then the countries actually choose to cut in health, education, social protection, or standard of living. Now, one of the perspectives that I think that sort of a narrative will be increasingly in the fold, and what we as civil society perhaps need to be clear about is the idea of IMF and the World Bank Group and the others are affiliate institutions with the United Nations. They should adhere to the recommendations of the Charter, as well as adhere to the development priorities pushed by the mainstream United Nations processes as well, meaning, for instance, sustainable development goals, which works towards poverty alleviation and addressing all of our crises and everything. Howsoever, the affiliate institutions and their mandate continues to work on the counterproductive note and exacerbating all of those crises. So it's a critical split in the consciousness of these multilateral processes, which we also need to start highlighting. I mean, IMF and World Bank, if they do not push for it directly, they also do not say that you don't have to apply cuts to healthcare, education, social protection, and standard of living either. So it's I don't know what to call it. It's a mumbo jumbo of contradictions in terms of the operations of multilateral processes, and I think civil society has to start echoing those kind of contradictions and expose them so that we can perhaps have a sense of policy coherence across these institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. I think you highlighted 2 points. Another, the role of the IMF and the World Bank in eroding healthcare systems that made everyone, especially in the global south, vulnerable to the extent of the impacts of the pandemic. How, despite their supposed pre-pandemic response, they're partly responsible for the level of harms created by the pandemic due to their historical neoliberalism that's continuing. And you also highlighted how they're split thinking, in that they sort of are institutions working within the United Nations, but don't seem to be bound by agreements and supposed norms that are working within these institutions. So before we pass on the microphones to our panelists, if they want to react, maybe we could hear I think Luis Vieira from Bretton Woods Project has also raised a hand. So after Luis, maybe we can go to our panelists for their thoughts. Go, Luis, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good morning, afternoon, evening, etc. to everyone. Thank you very much for organizing a very interesting and important discussion. I suppose I have I'd appreciate a couple of thoughts from the panelists, and I really appreciated their presentation, so thank you. One of which, we've been talking about neoliberalism, right, since the 1980s, but it's also true that the world economy has changed significantly since then, and the world economy has become much more financialized. For example, you look at BlackRock, the wealth management firm that now has nearly $10 trillion under management, which is about 300 times the GDP of Tunisia last time I checked. So I wonder if you can speak a little bit about how you see the financialized economy, or the fact that the economy has become increasingly financialized globally. How does that impact the relationship between the IMF, the World Bank, and others, and states, and the dynamics within the states? And then a couple other things. It's very interesting, and I think it was reflected in the previous speaker. I would appreciate your thoughts on how the elite politics in the countries that work under IMF and World Bank programming work, because I think sometimes we tend to paint a picture where states lack agency, that they do that they would do something contrary to the IMF and the World Bank if only they could. But I'm not so convinced that that's the truth. I think that the truth is more complex, where you have different alignments of political interests and elite interests that actually are well aligned with the diktats of the IMF and the World Bank. And in many cases, actually, the World Bank and the IMF are used as excuses for some things that the governments would do regardless. And then I'm sorry for speaking so long, but I just sort of also, I don't know if you're following this process, but you know that the World Bank is undertaking what they're calling a review of its, they're calling it an evolution roadmap. They're designing this, reacting to a G20 pressure. They're engaging in a process to review its operations, lending volume, capital adequacy framework, etc. And linked to also the Bridgestone initiative. I wonder if the panelists are following those processes and what their opinions are of those two processes. Thank you very much. And I apologize again for speaking so much. Thanks.
Thanks, Luis. Always welcome. Your thoughts are always welcome. So that's fine. We appreciate that. And I think Luis is saying, my understanding, three things, right? First, how do the panelists see, in so many ways, right, the current and prevailing dominance of finance capital and the trend of financialization? How does this fit into this analysis that you're describing? Secondly, how do dynamics that are perhaps unique in your countries, I guess in Chams's case, when it comes to the Philippines, or in Han's case in the Arab region, or perhaps Noel, in your analysis of who is the most powerful countries in this institution. So how do these political dynamics between states how are these playing out when it comes to these impositions that we're saying? Thirdly, some comments on the evolution roadmap, which is essentially a World Bank reform agenda that which I mentioned, I think, at the beginning, of the idea that the World Bank, to be fit for the crises of our time, they need to have more money, and they need to be better in responding to climate and poverty, and that's renewing their mandate, their development mandate, over in the long run. No? So these three things, and aside from Mr. Ali's comments earlier, anyone who wants to start their thoughts? No? Noel, I think Noel, go ahead.
Thank you. I think the countries are not monolithic. So when IMF comes to one country, it's not the government and the people coming together. No, we have enablers of IMF in governments, and these are the agents of the IMF who agrees and pushes these reforms and these conditionalities upon the working people of that country. So you have that, and that has been happening for many decades. As mentioned already, public spending in Pakistan have been decreased for so long, these austerity measures. So we not only have to look to the IMF, but we also have to look to our national governments and their role in these crises that we are suffering right now. Second, on terms of financialization, I think what we're discussing right now is public loans. We haven't yet, and this deserves another set of maybe webinars, no, and conferences on private loans, on bonds, for example. BlackRock can buy so much bonds from one country, and therefore that country is indebted to BlackRock, and they have such enormous, war vaults. They can short a country. I mean, short sellers, no, and they can predict a country to fall down. So in that term, these short sellers win in that kind of financial attack. So these are new developments. You're right in terms of financialization. So it really deserves another set of discussions, and it's layer upon layer of debt that countries are really facing right now. Yeah.
So Noel addressed the financialization and elite dynamics angle. Anyone else who want to add to the same discussions or want to feedback on the other discussions that hasn't been addressed yet? Cham, and then maybe after Cham, feel free to respond, Hani. Go, Cham.
Okay. So I'm going to react on Ali's point. No, I totally agree that the impositions of the IMF and the World Bank, Jay said that they are partly responsible for um, our experiences now during the pandemic, but I would say not partly, but largely responsible for what we've experienced during the pandemic. The austerity measures, the decrease in public spending for healthcare services, it really had an impact to women and their communities during the pandemic. And what is what we've also seen is how the pandemic was actually used by the IMF and the World Bank and our governments to borrow more money in the name of COVID response. No, the Philippines actually in 2021 was the World Bank's top borrower. No, with $3.07 billion fresh loans from the World Bank, and during the same year, the IMF also provided the Philippines 2.8 billion dollars, no, more loans during the pandemic. So we've seen that they actually used the pandemic not to force more loans and for the countries to borrow more. Um, with regards to the role of the government, Noel has clearly described that what we have seen in history is that IMF and the World Bank is known to, lend money to corrupt regimes. So we've seen that during the Marcos dictatorship in the 70s, the huge loans incurred by the Philippines was during the Marcos dictatorship, and we've known this government to pocket billions of dollars from those loans, no? And now the Filipino people are still repaying those loans. What we are also seeing is how the governments are very much enthusiastic in changing our policies, in changing our laws, so as to follow the dictates of IMF and the World Bank. I've mentioned the rice liberalization law, the water privatization, the train law. I think 2 years ago, we've amended the foreign direct investment law, the retail trade liberalization law, the Public Service Act, and a lot more laws and policies. We even the government is even pushing for charter change to fully liberalize our economy. No, and we've seen this, no, historically being dictated by the IMF and the World Bank, and our government is always very enthusiastic in following these dictates. So, yeah.
Thanks, Cham. Mr. Hani, any thoughts
Yes,
on the aspects that our colleagues from Zoom are mentioning?
I would like to highlight one point, and I will give one recommendation. In our national experience in Egypt, the prices of basic services, for example, increased by 200% since we come into an agreement with IMF in 2016 to provide Egypt with some loans in order to reform its economic and social programs, or to reform the economic situation in Egypt. Egypt was dictated to devaluate the national currency now 3 times. The Egyptian pound has lost almost 60% of its value since we started the program in 2016. And always we are pushed to increase the costs of the basic services. We didn't see any indicator that through the IMF loans, we could create new jobs for youth. We couldn't improve the living conditions for the poor people, but in contrary, the percentage of poor the people live under poverty line has been increased to 30% more than what we had before the intervention from the IMF or the World Bank Group. So all indicators give us a fact or a truth that the IMF is responsible for the deteriorating situation because of its conditionality and because of they have what we call a methodology that fit for all. I don't think that in economic reform, what can be implemented in Philippines or in China or in South Africa could fit what should be done in Egypt. Every country has its own context. Every country has its own governance system that should be taken into consideration while we design and develop a reform program. So my recommendation is that the responsibility of IMF and the World Bank Group to the increase of poverty proved through evidence-based research. So what we recommend is that they should, during their internal reform program, as you said, there is right now an intention to the IMF to reform by itself what is going, it is programs, structure, it is methodology. So in their reform program, they should accept the reality, the truth that they are responsible for the increase of poverty in developing countries, and they should stop their financial stimulus program that connected to increase the costs of basic services, and adopt a methodology that can fit each country, each context, and their programs or their financial programs must increase the capacity of the countries to adopt more digitalization in their value chains, increase their ability to export their products, and to increase the quality of services, the quality of products, the increase the ability to have food security for their nations, for their people, and also to increase their capacity to industrialize and to adopt new technologies for food production, for innovation in their industry. In that case, we can consider that IMF programs mandate is true, because the mandate of IMF is to decrease the poverty and to increase the decent life for all countries. Actually, we would like to push for this mandate, and this is a good mandate just if they follow it and stuck to implement it. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Mr. Hani. So I revert perhaps with two comments from online, and then let's read one question from online and then one from the floor, I think here in Manila. So I think we still have time for one final round of discussion. So if you have questions by now, feel free to send them so we could include them in the final round, because otherwise we could just continue the conversation later on. So first comment from Zoom, April from APWLD is saying that she just wants to add on Cham's point that the IMF is also trying to streamline their gender strategy, which in her view is a complete pink washing of the impacts of their policies at community level. And Luis was also clarifying that he is certainly not denying the power and the influence of the IMF and the World Bank in limiting policy space at country level, just that only interested to know more about the complex elite dynamics of how that plays out in pushing the dictates that you're discussing in other policy agendas. So those two comments. And thirdly, there's this question from online asking us, can the panelists share their thoughts on the issue of debt that the United States is also facing? How does debt crisis in the United States differ with the debt problems faced by the Global South? Does the US face the same problem as so-called structural adjustment pushed by IFIs that we do in the Global South? And maybe before the last question from the floor, maybe you could also, this is like me as moderator trying to provoke you to as well on the question of World Bank reform. So I think the political stakes there is that, do you think in this conjuncture in 2023, as in your from the perspective of your respective constituencies, would you allow that notion that the World Bank should be allowed to renew its mandate and reform itself in order to continue playing a global role, at a global role and a role at country level? So perhaps a provocative question before we proceed to one question from the floor here. Please go ahead. We can collect the question from the floor. Yeah. Please approach the microphone so that we can hear you, and kindly introduce yourself and your organization as well.
So hello, I'm Tala from Reality of Aid Asia Pacific, and I would like to thank the panelists for sharing their insights. Maybe just to also end or close off the session, it would be good to wanted to ask how are people's organizations and movements around the globe exposing the role of the IMF World Bank in the current crisis today, and are fighting back against these neoliberal policies that they have imposed on these countries, and how do we reclaim our future from IMF World Bank and all the other IFIs and their conditionalities. Thank you.
All right, so thanks, Tala. So anyone from the panelists? Questions on debt crisis in the US? How is it different from our debt crisis? The provocative question on, would you think there is room for World Bank reform from your perspective? And lastly, Tala's question. I think those are the three leftover questions at the moment, aside from the comments, if you still want to react on them. So, anyone? I think Noel is already picking up the microphone. So, go ahead.
Yeah, it's been in the news now about the US and how they have been haggling to raise the debt ceiling, but it's already, so they already raised the debt ceiling so they can pay. The one ace card that the US has is they are the only country that can print US dollar. So that's very important when it comes to, compared to, let's say, Zambia or the Vanuatu. They cannot print US dollars. It's only the US. So that's one big trump card, no, that the US has. Aside from, of course, it's a big economy. It controls most. It has a big controlling stake in IMF, in World Bank, in ADB. So this is what the US has, the power of the US. Aside, of course, again, you also have the issue of its military power, where it can pressure smaller countries into following its wants and needs. So I think that's the difference between the global South debt and the US debt. And that's me.
Well, I'm going to respond on the IMF and the World Bank reforms. Okay, I don't know how the IMF and the World Bank is going to reform itself with its history. A total overhaul is needed, no? But so long as it still follows the same neoliberal framework of development and it still serves the interest of the corporations of imperialist powers, I don't, or rather than the people, I don't think IMF and World Bank would be able to reform itself, no? Although, as it has been said earlier, no, IMF and the World Bank being part or being one of the UN institutions should adhere to the development priorities of the people, no? It is, but right now it is very, very much incoherent with women and people's human rights, no? Because it's taking or serving the interests of corporations, the imperialist powers, and not the people. And that's what we are seeing now. But maybe this is also a challenge for us in the people's movement. It is actually up for us, no, in the people's movement to expose these realities, to expose the IMF and the World Bank for what it is, link arms with each other, to hold the IMF and the World Bank accountable, hold our governments accountable, and I believe us in the people's movement have our alternatives, no? An alternative framework of development which would ensure women and people's right to development. And I think that merits another conversation. And I'm very excited to be part of that conversation in the future.
Perhaps, Cham, that's also your way of answering the people's resistance component, right? Mr. Hani, any more thoughts? Or are you good in the meantime?
Yes. I would like to say that it is a really challenge how to change the behavior of loan providers to the borrower countries and how to find the right way to fix economic reform and to ensure that poor communities benefit from restructural reform programs. But as I saw some questions and comments from the chats and from the participants, there are a lot of questions like, what about US and about what about IMF, the Chinese IMF? Always loans providers will link their loans with restrictive conditionality. And I think it is a responsibility of national policies and the governments to be aware that their countries must follow national programs that lead to decrease poverty and increase employment opportunities and to increase the economic return. It is, yes, if we believe that the IMF and the World Bank Group are going to have their own reform programs. So let's develop some consolidated recommendations for them in order to take into consideration our demands from the global south and to increase our inputs in this structural reform program for the IMF. And maybe we can also recommend that the global south should develop their regional and yes, their regional organizations, or like in Africa, for example, we have the African Development Bank group, and still their inputs are limited, but we hope that they can improve their quality of programs and their level of interventions in order to help African countries to reform their economies. Last but not least, I would like to thank the organizers and to thank the participants for their valuable inputs and the valuable comments. And I think it is just a small contribution in a very complicated debate at the international level. And because in our current economic situation, which is full of challenges, we always think about solutions that can save our countries, and we are in solidarity in order to have a better life for all. But it is still, we need a lot of work, and we need, especially, we need a real and very effective advocacy campaign in order to, in order our voice is taken into consideration at the international level. Thank you again.
All right, so excuse me. Thanks everyone for that enriching discussion at the end. So I think it was important that Mr. Hani highlighted the notion of solidarity at the end and how moving forward that's something that we could still pursue. I saw that there are still various questions from Zoom, some of which will be addressed by the next discussion, such as the question on the IMF and the World Bank in relation to militarism, for instance. So we have a separate session dedicated to that precisely for July. So keep your eyes peeled for that. So at this point, we hope to summarize in broad strokes the ideas, no, and the aspirations that we have generated this afternoon or morning, no. I guess just to, I guess at the end of the day, my last question to the panelists, not to be answered now, of course, but to provoke further, no, the panelists, is whether after the IMF and the World Bank has, in a way, for decades, you know, look at it this way: they have slapped you in the face for so long with their dictates, and now they're claiming that they could stop that on their own, even if historically they haven't done so. So would you allow them to have that initiative to do that on their own, or is it up to you who is being slapped to, you know, end the slapping? So I think it's an ill metaphor, but this is to provoke your further discussions on how do we see these institutions in our histories and what do we want to happen at the end. So before continuing that discussion, let's have Clarice Canonizado first from the Reality of Aid Network to give us some summary statements of what we have learned so far. Go ahead, Clarice.
So good afternoon and good evening to our participants, both here and on Zoom. I am Clarice Canonizado from the Reality of Aid Network. We are a Southern-led global network working on issues related to aid and development cooperation. And we are part of this campaign, the Reclaim Our Future campaign, which is an initiative that seeks to hold the IMF World Bank accountable for their role in further worsening the global crisis we are experiencing today. And to synthesize and cap off the first session of Reclaim Our Future, Noel from People Over Profit shared about how debt and loan conditionalities and in general neoliberal policies severely violate people's rights, especially in the global south. He shared about specific cases from Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Tunisia, in which the IMF World Bank pushed the national governments to end fuel, electricity, and food subsidies for the people, as well as enforce the privatization of state enterprises, the lowering of wages, and the shrinking of the public sector, among others. On the other hand, for the Philippine case, Cham Perez from the Center for Women's Resources shared about the burdens faced by Filipino women due to neoliberal policies imposed by the two banks and adopted by the Philippine government. She shared about the deposed dictator Marcos Sr.'s legacy, who basically laid down the foundation of neoliberal maldevelopment of the Philippines. So for instance, the automatic debt appropriations loan has ensured that 1/3 of the Philippine national budget goes to debt servicing alone. And as a result of this, basic social services such as healthcare, housing, and water access, among others, are gravely sacrificed. And specifically, under the context of healthcare services, the weakened healthcare services results in higher maternal mortality rate. And at the same time, women are also forced to take on more care work amid the lack of public services. And beyond that, the rice liberalization law, which she also discussed, resulted in the adverse impacts to the livelihoods of small farmers. And in the MENA context, on the other hand, as shared by Mr. Hani Ibrahim from the Nawat Institute, he shared that there is also a similar reality of crippling indebtedness and crisis. He stressed the importance of holding the IMF World Bank to account for the consequences of their policies in the global south. And at the same time, he also cited two important UN documents that tackles the adverse impacts of IMF loans on human rights. And so with these issues, we strongly amplify the following emerging calls: cancel and repudiate debts, and austerity measures, and regressive taxation schemes, and neoliberal conditionalities, prioritize domestic mobilization of resources such as taxing big corporations instead of resorting to debt to finance development, demand that developed countries fulfill their financing and development commitments, and finally, to foster people-centered development, including their full participation in policy and decision-making. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Clarice. So that's still a continuing process. No? So if you want to be involved in further hammering out these types of discussions, kindly contact any of our partner organizations today and or write directly to ifisoutof-recovery@gmail.com. So to end our program on a high note, no, we invite Carol Araulio from the Bagong Alyansang Makabayan or the New Patriotic Alliance, and also of the International League of People's Struggle Commission 1 to give us some closing remarks. So Carol has been a long time activist in the Philippine social movements, I think since the late 60s and early 70s, right? And has, since the resurgence of these social movements for national and social liberation against imperialism. And it's timely that we'll have her here because it's a week before the Independence Day of the Philippines, after all. So it might be pertinent to talk about sovereignty at this juncture. And she has continued her activism up to this day, throughout the anti-neoliberal struggles in the succeeding decades and up to the present. So we look forward to hearing from you, Carol. Feel free to have the floor.
Good day in all the time zones for this webinar. Congratulations to the co-sponsors of this webinar for helping us to connect the dots with regard to how overarching policies that are imposed on countries in the South by the IMF World Bank, which is mainly controlled by the developed countries, in particular the United States, historically and currently, for helping us to see the connections between the concrete impacts of such policies have on the dire impacts on the lives of a majority of the common people, and also how these policies in fact have a real effect on the status of human rights violations and on the level of social unrest and even armed conflict in countries today because of the extreme poverty and underdevelopment and misery generated by these policies. I recall to mind a quotation from a Dr. Norman Bethune, the Canadian doctor who, in solidarity with the Chinese people, worked during the struggle for national liberation in China. And he said that the wounds of poverty and ill health and the wounds of war are created by men in suits, in corporate boards, in IFIs, in international financial institutions, because these policies imposed really contribute to so much deplorable conditions of poverty and immiseration in countries, especially in the global South. I would like to, I hope that this webinar, which links researchers, scholars, and activists from several countries will help to generate more research that we can use in arousing, organizing, and mobilizing our peoples to take the necessary political action to change these policies by changing the bureaucrat capitalist, the politicians who enable these policies to take effect in our countries, and also research that can open the eyes of our people and help them also to connect the dots between their own situation and the kinds of policies imposed by imperialist institutions on them. So thank you very much and good day to all.
Thank you, Carol. Once again, this has been Debt and Dictates on the IMF and the World Bank's attacks against sovereignty. So before we formally close, we invite the Zoom participants to stay for a bit just for a photo, but we are saying goodbye to our friends at Facebook. So for our friends at Facebook, thank you for staying up to the end, and looking forward to see you at the next session in July on militarism and IFIs. So thank you very much to our friends at Facebook. No? Yes, but for our friends in Zoom who are still here, maybe we can, if you can, feel free to turn on your cameras just so we can see your face and we could take screenshots of you this afternoon or today, whichever time zone you're in. So our tech team will handle that, no? So Diane, I think will specifically will help us through that. So should I just count 1, 2, 3, and then Diane, are you up for it in terms of doing the screenshots? So okay. So 1, 2, 3 smiles. I hope I cannot. Okay, another one final screenshot. So 1, 2, 3. Perfect. Our tech team says it's perfect. So thank you very much for our friends online. Once again, this has been Debt and Dictates. So have a great morning, afternoon, evening. So let's. Tapos, pwede naman Tagalog. Wala akong laway at English. See you next